Or clean jokes.
Well, it's that time. So let me start out by welcoming all of you to Story and Song. Thank you so much for being here. One of the things we really enjoy is when we come across an author who has some local connection. So when I was introduced to Jimmy Deas and learned that one of his ministries was at First Baptist here in Fernandina, I thought, well, there's a connection. He's bound to know some people are bound to know him. Some secrets are probably better left buried, and we won't talk about that. But at any rate, when he introduced his book, it was our pleasure. So welcome to you, Jimmy.
Thank you. Appreciate
We
it.
certainly appreciate you being here. So before we kind of get into talking about the book, tell us a little bit about your personal path, just in terms of growing up and when and where you got the call and how life unfolded from there.
Okay. And I've just got to bring this into the picture here. This gentleman also lived in my little hometown of Jennings, Florida, which was the setting. I don't call it Jennings, but Jennings is on 41 just before you get into Georgia, below Valdosta, Georgia. And that was the setting. I changed things around, but I used our local part-time policeman who was basically a farmer, but he took care of the law enforcement issues. I used our local one back then, and as it turns out, that was this man's uncle. And I did ask him first off, did I describe your uncle well? And he said I did, and I feel like I did something well there. But I grew up in small towns, and I was here as a pastor. I pastored for 36 years full time. I've been retired almost 9 years. I was at First Baptist downtown, the old building, from 1984 through 1989. And I'm going to reference that in a little while about another book as well. I did not start writing until I retired. People ask me, how did you decide to become a writer? And I've got to tell this. A while back, I was doing a book signing, and a woman was looking at my books, and I was answering questions, and her little 10 or 11-year-old son stood there, and he just kept looking and looking at the stack of books. And finally, at the break in the conversation, this young man looks at me as serious as he can be, and he says, I can't believe you wrote all these books. And I said, I agree with you. I can't believe I wrote all these books either, which that's 6. I have 6 published books at this time. I didn't decide to become a writer, really. Now, I went into ministry. 36 years was my career there. I started kind of fooling around with writing after I retired, and a friend of mine who's an author talked to me about getting a little more serious about it. I never decided. It was something that was inside that just finally had to be expressed to get out. And I have talked to a number of authors, Mark, about and posed that to them as well. And most of them say the same thing. There was no conscious point at which they said, I'm going to be a writer, but it was more of something on the inside, ideas, thoughts, people, that just had to be expressed. And so I think that's kind of what got mine started. It was not an easy process. It probably took me 2 years to write that little book because I must have quit 17, 18 times. And then I'd get back to it once again.
What preceded this book?
The first book I had published, he mentioned my Facebook blog. I do a thing 3 days a week, a short blog about people I meet or interesting events or something. Mm-hmm. And I had done that for a few years just for the fun of it. And it was the friend that contacted me several years ago. And he said, if you'll combine those, compile them, that would make, I think the correct term is a coffee table book, just little brief vignettes. And he guided me through that process. And that was actually the first book I ever had published, called A Teacher's Gift and Other Stories. And the lead story in it was Mrs. Shiver, that was the math teacher for at least 150 years, it seemed, in Jennings. She taught everybody. And then after that first book was published, then this idea had been in my mind for a number of years to write about my hometown. Now, not all of the events in the book took place there. I borrowed from other places. I pastored 7 different churches, encountered some wonderful people, some people with good positive stories, some people with rather tragic stories.
Mhm.
And so in my different books, I've kind of meshed and merged, and I'll take this one from over here and put them in another place so that I don't identify too much with a person in a particular place, except Mr. Clate, and everything was positive about his uncle. So I didn't have to dodge anything or cover it up on that as well. But that is actually the second book that I had published. This was, once I got it out of my system, that was going to be it. I've done it. And then I learned that if you put contact information, and it's not in the back of this, in some of my books is email. I learned that people will contact you. And so people were asked, well, when's the sequel coming out? So I went back and I did a second book that is, that I put in Live Oak, Florida, which is another small town. That's where I currently live, over in Dunn. And then people, and some of them are here, friends in Fernandina, ask, well, why don't you do something about Fernandina? And so that was book number 3, called Prodigal Sons. And now I'm working on book number 4, which will also be here in Fernandina, which I call Dorado Beach. And hopefully it's going to be, I'll have it ready in the next few months, and it'll be available as well. Yes, ma'am.
So I'm confused whether this is fiction, I'm newer to this area too. I don't know these little towns like you just said in Florida. Where is that one you just mentioned?
Okay. Jennings, where I located this one, it's on 41, but it sits on 41 just to the east of Interstate 75, a couple of miles below the Florida-Georgia line.
But in Florida?
It's in Florida. The second book, and I was actually lived here before I lived in Live Oak. I got the turn around the horse and the cart on this one. But the second book, I placed it in Live Oak, where I currently live. I call it Oak Glen. And not intending to write book number 3. And so then I had to find another location. So I moved my pastor character over here and called it Dorado Beach.
And where's Live Oak, please?
Okay, Live Oak, the intersection of Interstate 10 and Interstate 75.
Oh.
If you've ever been through there, 10 and 75 at Lake City.
It's about an hour and a half.
It's about an hour and a half or so.
Okay.
I live 25 minutes west of the intersection, the junction of 10 and 75. So, and the reason small towns, 2 things kind of guided me in my writing. And one of them was Mark Twain's excellent advice. Mark Twain once told a group of would-be writers, write what you know. I know small towns, I know Baptist churches, I know country people.
Mm-hmm.
That basically is what I write about.
So tell us a little bit about some of your more memorable moments as a pastor to these various congregations. There have to be a few things that just kind of really stand out, I'm guessing.
Fernandina Beach was very memorable. Not trying to drag skeletons out of the closet, but when I came to this church in 1984, it had been through a difficult period. A good number of members had left the church because of issues within the church. And I had never done this before, but when I came up and preached in view of a call, I knew that there'd been difficulties. So I knew that I wasn't going to get that 90-something% vote that preachers like to get. So in my prayer time, I asked God to give me 80% of the vote. Now that would still mean that out of every 10 people sitting in those pews, that 2 of them were not in favor of me coming as their pastor. But realistically, I felt 80% because this is a very divided congregation. So I asked God for that 80%. And the day that the committee called to tell me that they had voted, I asked the chairman what the percentage was, and he said 79.5%. And my heart sunk because I had 2 girls, one in middle school and one just in high school. And, kids and beach, that's all it took for them. My girls were already packing. And when he told me 79.5%, I told him I have to get back with him. And then I told my wife and my girls, I said, I'm sorry, I can't go. We can't go. We can't go. I asked God for this. I did not get it, and I'm not gonna fudge there. And so they didn't even want to eat their lunch. It was, we were home after our church, back at our church, and it was like gloom and doom. And in a few minutes, the phone rang, and the chairman, who is still here, well-known person, he said, it probably won't make any difference, but he said, we miscalculated the first time. He said, you actually got 81% of the vote.
Oh, wow.
So that's what brought us. We came here, we spent 5 years, and I saw the church come back together and heal, so to speak. I saw two men who would not even speak to each other for the first 2 years I was here. If they met on the sidewalk out in front of the church, they turned to go in the opposite direction. I saw the day when they sat by one another in a pew and shared a hymn book. So this was one of the most meaningful, and we've been gone 33, 34 years, I guess now, and still our greatest connections with people are in Fernandina Beach.
So, excuse me, when were the 5 years you were here?
84 to 89, and I was at the old downtown building, what's now, I can't remember, it's where they're building redoing the old education building and making lofts on Fifth. The old church building next to that.
It had been taken over by a Hispanic congregation, La Tierra Prometida. I think that's
Okay.
the promised land.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
So that's that old building downtown, corner of Fifth and Alachua.
Fifth and Alachua. And in the book, the third in the series, one of the great mysteries, or the real mystery of the book, has to do with that old building, and that's all I'll say about that.
Oh, okay.
But
Well,
the building
you'll
comes
have to
into play.
stay tuned for that, for us to be able to have that third book available for you. It's going to take some doing to get it.
Yeah, it's going to take some doing to get it.
But
So
we'll get it sooner or later. Now, your main character in this book and in the others is this Reverend Mark Thomas, who's like 25 years old. This is his first congregation, right, in this story, in this small town. How closely does that parallel your own experience? Do you remember your first?
yes, and really what I put in there is, and this goes back to Mark Twain, Write What You Know. That's kind of a composite of my first maybe 2 to 3 churches and things I encountered and had to learn. They don't teach you everything in a classroom. You learn a lot of things the hard way. And I don't know if you remember, let me reference back the pastor. Now I was Southern Baptist, but the population of Jennings was about 550 plus the dogs when I lived there. Now, it's a small town, but we do have one outstanding citizen. Some of you may remember an actor, he's in his 80s now, an actor named Andrew Prine, Andy Prine. He was in several John Wayne Westerns. And usually he was a supporting actor, but he was in a lot of stuff. So he was from Jennings. He's our big name person from Jennings. But everybody knew everybody in town. Mark Thomas, if you will remember, I'm not sure if he was still living because he died in the early 60s suddenly of a heart attack. Maurice Thomas was the pastor of the Primitive Baptist Church on the just as you going out of town. He was not my pastor, but he was one of those men that I had great respect. I mean, when he walked in the room, you respected that man. There was just something about him that you respected. And so when I was creating my characters and trying to give them names, my fond memories of Reverend Thomas, but I called him Mark instead of Maurice.
Where was your first ministry?
My first ministry was in a little town, Barney, Georgia, which is known for its peaches And when I went there to pastor, the population was about 275 people.
Wow.
It was very small. And I can't remember his name. He's been since retired. The most famous person to come out of that town, and I never knew him individually, was an African-American football player that went to the University of Georgia and then played several years for the Jacksonville Jaguars. He was a defensive tackle, one of these big guys.
Yeah, I can't think of who that
So,
would be.
but anyway, small towns,
Yep. And
I can relate to those. Yes, ma'am.
so where were you raised?
In Jennings, which is the setting there, and also in the adjoining county, until I was until I got married and moved to Valdosta, the population was about 35,000. That was the largest place I'd ever lived.
Okay.
I had never lived in a town over about 2,000 people
Oh, wow.
as a boy.
Okay.
So I had that small town country background.
What inspired you to the ministry? I mean,
That-
were you following in your father's footsteps
No,
or
no,
anything
no,
like
no,
that?
no. Now that is a calling. I knew when I was 18 years old and graduated from high school, I knew that's what I should do.
Wow.
But we never lacked for stuff as a family. I mean, we never went hungry or anything like that, but there was never any extra money to spend. I tell a story in one of my books, one of the coffee table books. I tell the story about being 16 years old, and my mother at that time in the 60s, she was allotted $20 a week for groceries. Now that was, you could buy a lot of stuff for $20 in 1962 and 1963. There were 6 in the family. My mother would take the weekly paper on Saturday morning, spread it out on the table, and she would start writing down what she could buy, and she would total it up. She always bought what was on sale. Chicken, 19 cents a pound. Can of salmon on sale for 9 cents maybe, or something like that. And anyway, when she totaled everything up, it could not exceed $20. And then she would take her list and go to town and back. And I needed a pair of shoes, $8.95 penny loafers. Only we went to buy them, and the price had gone up to $9.95. And so my mother had to take a dollar out of the groceries, and a dollar back then would have bought a 5-pound bag of potatoes and a gallon of milk. So that was a big sacrifice on her part. I'm not chasing a rabbit here. The 18-year-old graduated from high school. I wanted things, and I wanted to be somebody and be successful. And so I had an 8-year career with Sears. At the age of 27 or 28, I was the youngest person to hold my job, my position in Sears in all of the southeastern states. And the day I got the promotion that I had worked so hard for, I resigned that day. Because I realized this is not what life is all about. And more importantly, this is not what I'm supposed to be doing with my life. And so I resigned. I stumbled around for a couple of years, and then finally I did enter the ministry. So it was a calling that I resisted for 12 years.
So I see the parallel, because Reverend Thomas in the book was working at a retail department store in Valdosta, I believe, just across the border. So it sounds a little familiar.
In December of 1965, I delayed starting college, so I was a little bit late starting. In December of 1965, I worked in that Belk store in downtown Valdosta, Georgia. I use a lot of my experience and other people as well, the things I've observed in people's lives in the book. But yes, I actually did that.
And I was curious, and forgive me, because, just in terms of my background, I don't know hardly anything about Southern Baptist and the ministry and calling, but there's a part where Reverend Thomas has this parish, I mean, this church where he is pastoring, but then he's talking about wanting to go back to seminary.
Mhm.
Does one have to come before the other, or
No,
do you just start preaching?
and this can be a negative or a positive, depending on how you look at it. Southern Baptists have always been, they've never been a denomination that required theological training like some denominations do, which that can be a drawback. I did not. I had college. I majored in education. I was going to be, when I was going through college, and then I decided, no, I'll go to work with Sears. I was going to be a history teacher and a basketball coach. Never got to do either one of them. So I kind of used that parallel there. I did not have any theological training. I was in the ministry for 2 years before I realized that I needed it. And then I also went to seminary. So him leaving and going to seminary, yes, there's a parallel there. The difference is when I did, I was married and had 2 children. And in the book, he was just newly married when he goes back to seminary.
So in the Baptist faith, you're saying that it's the minister's choice to do the seminary?
Yes. And churches now, let me say this, small churches, little country churches, and this is where I started out, very small churches. The first church I ever pastored, if everybody was there, which never happened, if every member of that congregation, including my family, was present in church, there'd be a total of 49 people there. So it's small churches, they call what they can afford, so to speak. There comes a point that churches will say, we want someone with a Master of Divinity degree. Simply for the fact that reflects that person has made the effort to get the theological training needed to pastor at that level.
I get it.
So it took me 12 years when I went back, I eventually did earn my doctorate.
Wow.
And that's another story, but anyway.
So one thing you really hardly ever think about, or most of us, I think, hardly ever think about, is the business side of a church. Because even the smallest church, you've got to pay rent, you've got to pay utilities. And I'm thinking, how do you do that with a congregation of 49 people?
Yeah.
It's got to have its challenges.
Yeah, that small church, they did not have any indebtedness because they had built the building themselves, basically. Small block, block building. They had built the building and kind of paid it off. And now I had a full-time job when I started pastoring that church in 1977. And it was my full-time job that really paid the bills because they only could afford to pay me $75 a week. So,
I guess what I'd like to hear more about is that very first experience, because you say you got the calling and you knew that this is what you wanted to do. How do you go about getting that first job?
Well, I don't know how others do it. Usually if a person goes, let's say a man graduates from college, and if I had not been, okay, this is admission time here. If I had not been so hard-headed and stubborn when I graduated from high school, one of my teachers, dear godly lady, she made arrangements for me to go to a Baptist school, that's college that now no longer exists, but Norman Park, you'll probably remember that. There was a Baptist college in Norman Park, Georgia. She made arrangements for me to go. I would have had to work my way through, but she saw the path that God wanted for me. Stubborn, hard-headed. My dad had a different plan. He said, you stay home, go to the junior college 30 miles away and save up your money over the summer and buy the hottest thing in America in 1965, and that was a Mustang.
I was gonna say.
I was so hard-headed, I moved to Jacksonville and worked on my own for a while and then realized this is not working out. So I moved back home and went to college and ended up working my way through college anyway. So if a man graduates, goes on to seminary, when he comes out of seminary, there are all of our seminaries have placement services.
Yes.
And if you, sir, were chairman of a Baptist church and y'all were looking for a pastor, you can contact seminaries and tell them basically, okay, we're looking for somebody between the ages of 30 and 40. That kind of what you're looking for. And they keep a file of their graduates. It kind of would fit what you're looking for. Back to me, I had no experience. And when I finally just surrendered and I said, okay, God, this is how naive I was, how green, wet behind the ears. I called some churches in South Georgia that didn't have pastors and say, hey, I'm called to preach and I'll be glad to be your pastor. Basically, that's what I did. And none of them wanted me. None of them wanted me.
But you were working full-time.
I was working a full-time job. I had left Sears and done some other work, and then I had gone back to Sears and I was selling appliances.
Okay.
And that was what fed my family. I finally said, that's it, God, I tried. Don't bother me with this anymore. I'm going to pursue my career with Sears again. And within a couple of days, the man that had been baptized me as a 10-year-old boy invited me back to his church to preach. And it seems that after that Sunday, my phone kept ringing, not every week, but only very, very frequently. Churches asked me to come preach because their pastor was sick. He was on vacation. They didn't have a pastor. And eventually the little church, the first one that called me in South Georgia, they didn't have a pastor. They simply called me to come fill the pulpit. And one thing led to another and another and another. And in 4 months' time, I was the pastor of the church. And then it went on from there. So I could have gotten there a lot faster if I had not been so stubborn and hard-headed. So let me say this, Mark.
Sure.
I have written one of my books is it's not a very thick book, and it's not deep theological stuff. I say it's written for the person that sits in the pew, but I've written a little book called The Jonah Trait. I preached through that book a number of years ago, and one of the people in the church said, that'd make a good book. And so anyway, the Jonah Trait, and one of the basic things I try to bring out in the book is that all of us have this Jonah in us. God said, I want you to go to this place, and Jonah says, no, I'm going in the opposite direction, and I'm not going to do what you tell me to do.
Yeah.
And we all have that. And ma'am, I had a lot of it as a young person. So.
But don't you think most young people, do question all that stuff when they're young? I mean, the general younger person, struggles with what they want to make their life of. And I was a teacher, of young kids at different ages and raised kids. So I think that's sort of common.
Well, I was convinced, I really wanted to be I loved history. I wanted to be a history teacher and coach basketball.
You said that. Yeah.
And so that was the direction I was going to go in.
Too.
So,
Over the course of your career, did you ever feel like you'd run out of material when you were writing sermons?
Good question.
boy, he's asking some good questions here. When I started preaching, I had my college. I didn't need anything else. And what concerned me was the first couple of years is that hey, I'm going to be preached out of I'll preach all the Bible in 2 years. What am I going to do then? Well, the more I preached the Bible, the more I realized you cannot exhaust it. And then after 2 years, then I realized I know nothing. And that's when I went back and started my theological training, which my wife had to love me to stick with me through 12 years and typing countless papers and things like that. But at first I was afraid I was going to run out, and then I realized after a while, I did not do this early in my ministry. I'm not sure exactly when I started doing it, but I started keeping copies of notes, and I have printed copies of probably 2,500 sermons in my library, filed in notebooks now.
So did you find after the beginning of going back to divinity school or wherever, that it was your material you were finding easier to preach and have new?
When I started, when I enrolled, like a lot of institutions, they we took a test, and you could get credit for some courses depending on the score you made on this.
Oh.
Now, again, I can truthfully say that I started attending church 9 months before I was born, because my mother was that kind of person. I was raised in the church. I was raised with the Bible. Thought I knew the Bible. When I took that test to see how much credit I could get on courses, I thought they had invented a new Bible. You know, boy, it was a shock to me what I did not know about the Bible.
Wow.
And I didn't get much credit either off of that test. Yes, sir.
I was curious what aspect of the ministry you enjoyed the most.
The preaching. Enjoy the preaching. There was a lot of satisfaction in counseling young people, couples, married. There are couples in Fernandina Beach that I married 30-something years ago that are still married, thank goodness.
Oh,
And I can't, as a pastor, you were a teacher. If anybody here ever taught school, and I had a sister that was a 42-year career school teacher, we share a lot of the same feelings. The satisfaction that's almost impossible to put into words, if you're a preacher or a teacher, to see someone that I did a wedding for, or a teacher taught someone years ago, and to see where they have come in their life and what they've done with it. It's special. Get a little emotional here about this. Brett Whitaker, downtown at Robinson Jewelers. Brett's the younger brother. My wife and I were in there earlier today. I married Brett and Jeanette 30-something years ago.
Wow.
And when I walk in there and see him and know that marriage lasted, they've got, I think, 6 children now.
Oh my God.
And it just gives me a feeling that I cannot put into words. I feel like, that was something good there. A lot of satisfaction in a lot of different things. But I did enjoy the study and the preaching. And for me, by the time I got to the pulpit on Sunday morning, I'd already gotten the greatest satisfaction out of just studying, I guess, the student part of me, studying and preparing that sermon before I ever got to the pulpit.
One of the things that I think makes this book such a compelling read is that it starts out with this young pastor witnessing a pretty horrific accident where a young boy, a senior in high school, gets hit by a car, and he's cradling him on the way to the hospital, blood all over him and all this. And the young boy doesn't make it. So I'm not giving anything away here in particular. But he's called upon to basically preside over a funeral service. And I was struck by just how genuine a person he is to be able to admit his fear. Like, how do I do this? I've never had any experience doing this. What would this be like? What do I talk about? What do I say? How do I provide comfort? I mean, it was just so real to go through something like that. And I think that is a defining moment, I think, just in terms of his growth and evolution.
And that was my own experience. I had been in the ministry maybe a year. And my ministry started out in South Georgia, and I was really committed there. and a little church, another country church. Bivocational is the proper term for it. A lot of times people call it part-time. That means the preacher's got to work a job to support his family because the salary of the church is not enough to live on. And there was a church in the county that I grew up in that contacted me, and the chairman of the committee, he and I had been on the same basketball team together. And I knew everybody on that committee. In fact, when I was a kid, maybe 12 years old, we had actually been a member. My family was a member of that church for about a year, but I knew everybody down there. Had gone to school with a lot of them. And so they called and they said, we want you to be our pastor. I had no desire to go back home. And I declined. And they called a few more times. And then they started playing dirty. They tried to get my parents to influence me somewhat. But no, seriously, about the third time the chairman called, I was overcome with guilt. And I told my wife, I said, you know, I have known Wayne since we were boys. We played ball together. He's a friend. So I don't want him to feel that I'm being rude or anything. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to go down and we're going to preach. And Baptist churches, this way it's done. In Methodist church, if you're a Methodist, you know, then the bishop assigns you to a church. Other denominations, I'm not sure exactly how they do it. But in Baptist churches, each church, they bring in a pastor and let him preach. And then they vote if that's the guy they want. And so I said, we're going to go down and I'm going to preach. And they'll vote to call me. I know that bunch. I know them well. They'll vote to call me as their pastor. And then I can say, no, I feel I need to stay in Georgia where I am. That was the plan. We go down that Sunday. I preached. We walked out and got in the car. Her children were both small. They got them in the back seat and settled in. My wife and I got in, looked at one another, and it was like, this is where we're supposed to be. It was just that solid. This is where we're supposed to be. And that was the church I was in then when I started back to seminary and pastored and worked and went to school all at one time there. I did my first funeral in that church. And so a lot of what I expressed there is I can remember when that person died, I did my first funeral. It was the deer in the headlight. What in the world am I supposed to do? I've never done one before. And a lot of me is in the book, including. Now, I'm not going to give this away to them, but if you read the book, you know, including how he buys his wife's engagement ring. That's me.
We just had something else and it slipped away.
I was going to ask,
go ahead.
If you're in the Baptist church and there's a funeral and then you would be the preacher as the minister, is there a custom to allow family members? In my faith, there is a custom to allow family members to do a little speaking, immediate family on the eulogy, a little, not, you know, afterwards or whenever.
Yes, quite often family members. In fact, first time in counting full time and now retired, and I'm still active in preaching. First time in 44 years this has happened to me. A couple of weeks ago, no, it was last week. Today's Friday. Okay. Last Friday at 3:00 in the afternoon, a young man, he's not young anymore. He was a member of the church that I pastored for 20 years and retired from in Live Oak. He was a member of the church. He went to, he got his music degree and was called to a church outside of Gainesville, Florida. And so we've kept up over the years. He called me at 3:00 last Friday afternoon and he was, panicked. He said, I need your help. We have a problem. An hour before, their pastor had tested positive for COVID. They had a funeral planned on Saturday. And then, can you conduct a funeral of someone I didn't even know?
Mm.
And then preach on Sunday? I said, if it's okay with the family, you contact the family first. And if it's okay, well, in 30 minutes time, the family said, we'd be happy for you to do it. I tell the story to say this: the eulogy and stuff was done by two of her granddaughters, and they did a marvelous, wonderful job. And it made my part then easier
Yes.
because I didn't know the lady.
Yeah.
She, total stranger.
Okay.
So the question I was going to ask is, essentially, this story, Ran Like Joseph, is a mystery. It's, I wouldn't call it a thriller, but it's a good old-fashioned mystery. There is, so I guess my question for you is, what motivated you to go in that direction, and how do you come up with the storyline in terms of what is it that makes it mysterious?
Okay. He mentioned that the story starts, do you remember Ms. Culberth that was the postmistress there in Jennings?
Not really.
Okay, all right. Out in front of the school, her house has been torn down, but if you walked out the front of the school in Jennings and walked across the grassy area where the teachers used to park out there was a white house, white frame house up by 41. Our postmistress was widowed, and she took big old house. Her children were grown, they'd moved away. She had this big house. She partitioned off the back end and made a little apartment out of it. Put a bathroom and plumbing, and even put a little kitchen in it. She made an apartment in the back, and usually she rented it to single teachers that would come to town. For the whopping sum of $20 a month, which in the 1960s was that was a fair amount of money. That's where I placed the young pastor comes to town. He's single, and so he and Miss Culberth, bless her heart, she was a member of the Baptist Church, sweet dear lady. That all worked out. I used that as my idea. And the story starts is they have finished their evening meal. He had eaten with her. They're sitting on the front porch, and this young man runs out in front of the car. He gets hit. In the book, they place him, and back in those days, in the mid-60s, there were no ambulance services in small counties. The ambulance service was conducted by the funeral home.
Mm-hmm.
So they call down in, what isn't that really, Jasper, Florida, they need the ambulance. Well, the ambulance, the only one in the county from the funeral home, had just left to go pick up a dead body. And so the police chief, who in reality is this man's uncle that I use, okay, they put him in the back of his little pea green colored Comet.
Mm-hmm.
They put him in the back, and the preacher holds him, and they take him down to the hospital, which was only 12 miles away. That whole thing, that was the kernel of corn, I guess, that started the whole. That had been my idea in the back of my mind for a number of years. When I was 15 years old, one night we needed a loaf of bread, and my daddy was closing up his service station, and he was taking care of that, and he remembered Mama said, we need a loaf of bread. So Daddy said, I had my learner's permit. I knew how to operate the car. Daddy said, take the car, and the only place open was Wilmer Tools, which was back up the street, 3 blocks. He said, take the car and go get a loaf of bread, but don't go 41. Go around that back street. That was a big mistake, because as I took the back street and was driving through, a 1956 Pontiac, I think, that weighed as much as a Sherman tank. That's when they put real metal bumpers on them. You know. I drove by the little Assembly of God church there. They were in revival. They had just gotten out, and a little girl darted out between cars. I hit the brakes, but it broke her hip, put her in the hospital. She had to have surgery. She survived. Doesn't hold it against me. She's my Facebook friend today. saws, and you probably went to school with some of them, the saws. That was really the idea for the accident. Of course, I turned it around and I used it, and he does not make it. He dies. But that was so to speak, the seed had been in my mind for years of take that and make a story out of it. Now, something that that I didn't know when I wrote this, and there's a man I've never met. He lives in a suburb of Atlanta. His name is Doug Dahlgren, for what it's worth. He has written a number of novels. He was a military guy, and he's written a number of the military spy mystery kind of thing. He has a Friday radio program, and he interviews authors, and he interviews, most of his guests are well-known authors. Somehow somebody shared my name with him. And so last year or a couple of years ago, he was gracious enough. I was able to do it from my home by phone, but he interviewed me for an hour on his radio program. And we talked about the book. And I brought this out. He was asking me questions. How did you develop this plot? How did you do this? Because he got a copy of the book ahead of time and he read it, so he knew what to ask. And the thing about writing, if you've ever written, I would start writing something, and somewhere along the way, suddenly my fingers are moving, and a story is being created on my screen that I did not think of. A lot of the twists and the turns that story takes, I did not think of them in advance. I started writing, and all of a sudden it just, and it's one of those, when it happens, you just want to back up and say, whoa, where is this coming from? I mentioned that to this Doug Dahlgren, who, again, he's been writing for years and has a lot of published books. And he said, there's a term for that. He said, when that happens, the story takes on a life of its own. And when that happens, that's when it really becomes a story, so to speak. And I experienced that. The fourth book in this series that I need to get finished, that takes place here, it opens, strangely enough, I have a different name for it, but the opening in the book I'm working on right now, the opening chapter is at the Palace Saloon.
Oh, really?
Yes, Palace Saloon. Okay, I had a character in mind. He is the bartender. I gave him a name. That's one thing I do when I start thinking about a novel. I sit down and try to think about all the characters I want and the roles they're going to play, and I give them names. And I even think about, now, what kind of personality do I want them to have? What is this person actually physically going to look like? And that's where his uncle, when I had to have a chief of police for here, well, that was not rocket science. It was his uncle that fit the bill precisely. But anyway, this character, he's the bartender, he's down at the Palace Saloon, and he's basically, after the first chapter, he will briefly pop up through the rest of the book. But he's going to do his thing in chapter 1, and it's going to be over and done. Well, the more I wrote, it was like that character says, no, I'm not satisfied with just this little bit. I've had to go back, rename him, give him a new career, and somebody that was just going to be
A minor.
minor player in the story now has become one of the major characters in the book. And this person, this is what's going to be, and I've already in my mind is going ahead to the end of it and how it's going to end. This character that was supposed to have a little bit in the first chapter and then basically disappear is going to be in the last sentence of the book. So that's, I don't know if real writers, I refer to myself as the amateur accidental writer, if real writers sit down and think all of these plots out and they have it all in their mind and they know exactly what every character is going to do, God bless them if they can do that. But I find it as I write, it takes on its own life, and characters will enlarge and become. And the book I'm working on, I got maybe about halfway through, and this came to me. When I came here to the First Baptist Church in 1984, a few weeks after I came, oh gosh, I can't think of the name of it now, right up on Atlantic Avenue and probably 10th Street, coming this way, 9th or 10th at Atlantic, there's an African-American Baptist church up there
Mount
right on the
Zion.
corner.
Yeah, it's Mount Zion.
Mount Zion, okay.
Yeah.
That pastor, elderly gentleman, I say he's younger than I am now, but back then in his 60s or so was more elderly to me. He came by the church and wanted to talk to me. And he asked me if he had seen my name in the paper where I had come as the new pastor. And he wanted to know if he saw my last name, and he wanted to know if I had any relations, was I kin to any of the Deases in Hamilton County, which is where I grew up. Well, long story short, we get to the end, filling in the gaps in the conversation. That pastor of that Mount Zion Baptist Church worked on my grandfather's farm when he was a teenager. So as I was in the process of writing the book that I'm trying to write now, about halfway through the book, I remembered that incident. And all of a sudden, a character kind of based on him has developed in the book and has become very important to what's going on in the book. So, yes, sir.
Well, this is right along with what you're talking about. You said you're kind of an accidental writer, and you're talking about the moments of inspiration. But on the other side, I was curious, what's your sort of like day-to-day discipline as a writer? You know, you get up in the morning, you sit down, or whatever your habit is. What is your habit? And I'm sure you're not having those inspirations when your fingers go on their own all the time. There's probably plenty of times where you're just slugging it out. What's that like?
The writer's block thing,
Yeah,
that's absolutely true there sometimes. And I just stop. I just back off with it. Now, I write in the last 7 years, I guess I've published 6 books. I'm working on 2 more. I write the little blog 3 days a week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I try to write a blog. Some days I don't get to do it, but I try to write a blog Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And then I write a newspaper column for a newspaper in the next county. I have a Friday column in their paper. So I'm constantly writing. It's laying on the table over there. I've got a little notebook I carry with me everywhere. I learned that as a pastor. When an idea comes, write it down. Some wise person said that the dullest pencil is better than the sharpest mind. And I learned a long time ago, write it down. And so I carry that little notebook. It's on that table over there. I'm constantly writing. If something comes to me, I'll make a note of it and might use it later, either in a book, the blog, or the newspaper column.
So how many hours a week do you work on your craft?
Pardon?
How many hours a week do you work on your craft in a typical week?
It varies. I try to work. I'm an early riser, 5:30 in the morning. I usually get up and have my breakfast. My wife, she usually gets up about the crack of 9, so which is a good thing that we operate on different schedules. I usually try to write and work until noon, and then put it away for the day. And maybe that was one reason that this took months and months. I'll say 2 years. I'm not sure it took that long. Is I learned you can't force it, or at least I can't. If I reach that point, I just stop. Okay, let's clear the mind here.
So some mornings when you're starting, you just abandon it pretty much right away because you're in the writer's block thing that you hear about, you're saying?
Yes, ma'am. Sometimes one of the best things that I do is take my coffee and go out on my patio, and we have like 9 bird feeders in the backyard. I just go out and sit on the patio and drink my coffee and watch the birds and try to let my mind just kind of wander around a little bit.
Any other questions at this point? Anything else you want to, I guess my last question for you is, I'm thinking about, out of the mouths of babes, and you were talking about how you had this opportunity to be in front of 100 or so high school kids or whatever it was.
I think they said there was 500 kids viewing
Okay.
that on Wednesday that had
So,
logged in on their computers.
and they compiled their questions for you. What was the most interesting or the toughest question that you got from that group?
There really weren't any tough questions. What the virtual school teachers did was the week before they had asked the kids to submit their questions. Now, they didn't say this, but hey, we were all teenagers one time, okay? I'm thinking most of the kids didn't even submit a question. But the questions that were submitted, the instructors kind of sorted through them and combined them into 11 basic questions that they ask. How did you start writing? What is your inspiration? What's the part you like best? What you don't like best? What significant things have resulted from some of your writings? Those are some of the questions that I remember.
So it's a lot of like what we talked about today.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know if this has got anything to do with my writing or not, but to me it does. Long before I ever thought that I would be a writer, until I started writing books in 30-something years of ministry, the only thing I had ever written was one of our denominational publications asked me to write a commentary explanation of the weekly Sunday school lesson that was printed in that publication. They published every week, and they would have someone. They would ask a pastor or seminary professor or somebody to expound on the Sunday school lesson on that scripture for the week. And I was honored and asked to write those lessons for a quarter. And that was only professional writing I had really done. Years ago, I read the Jan Karen series, The Mitford Chronicles. And if you've never read them,
they're great.
ask this man to get them for you.
Yeah, they're awesome.
The Mitford Chronicles, she writes about a fictional Episcopal priest, Father Tim, in a fictional North Carolina town. My mother harassed me until I read those books. Once I read the first one, I was hooked. She does a wonderful job. I think there was 9 in the series, and then she wrote some other things, but there was maybe 9 in the Mitford Chronicles series. And I read those years ago, and the thought occurred to me back then, Mark, if I ever wrote anything, this is what I would want to write. Obviously, as a pastor and a Christian, I'm not going to write bad, vulgar stuff. And secondly, my mother is in heaven, but if I ever put anything bad in a book, she'd find some way to reach down and discipline me anyway. But that thought was in my mind years ago. If I ever wrote, that's kind of stuff I'd like to write. Now, please understand, I am not on Jan Karen's level. And it's something that amazed me about that woman. And if you read her books, I would read her books and at times just have to stop. Just impressed is an insufficient word about how that woman could describe exactly how a pastor feels when there's a tragedy in the church, when there's a death, when there's a whatever, that makes you feel just really breaks your heart kind of thing. She, never having been in that position herself, described it better than anybody I've ever seen. Now, a lot of what's in my books, comes from my heart. I've been there. I've done that. I've done that first funeral. I know the struggle that was involved there.
And you know what, Jimmy? It's for that very reason that you shouldn't sell yourself short. I think that book is excellent. It's a really, it's a captivating tale, and it's authentic. So anyway, that's my 2 cents worth.
Yeah, one little, the thing that's in, I think, the second book in Borrowing from People, there was a, trying to get which sister he was with. He was 4 years younger than me. A student in Jennings. He was raised. His mother. I don't know what happened to his dad, but his mother had remarried. He was the stepson in the family, and today the father would be arrested and put under the jail for child abuse. But in the 1960s, nothing was done. Frankie, not only was he redheaded, he was the redheaded stepchild in every sense of the word. He was not allowed to sleep in the house. There was a back porch, and he had to sleep on the back porch no matter how hot it was, no matter how cold it was. He slept on the back porch. He had a cot out there. The rest of the family ate a meal. If there was anything left, then Frankie could go and have what was left over. The kid had a difficult time. We didn't know a lot of this as we were growing up. It unfolded after I was gone, especially. One of the tragic things that happened is not long before he graduated. Well, one thing good thing that would happen is my sister and the girls in his class, when they began to pick up on what was going on, and they would go to lunch in that old cafeteria there, you know, my sister and the girls in the class, they would like, Frankie, I can't eat all of my mashed potatoes. Do you want them? I can't eat all of my meatloaf or whatever. So the girls made sure Frankie had food to eat at lunch anyway, because in all probability, he didn't get any breakfast, he didn't get any supper. So they kind of fed him. And when he was 11th or 12th grade, I was already graduating and gone. Frankie came to school one day, and there was blood in his shirt. And they checked it out and found out what happened. Porch swings, you know, the chain that's used to hang a porch swing.
Yeah.
His stepfather had beaten him with some of that chain and just lacerated his back. Well, the kids went home and told their fathers in that neighborhood, out in that community. And that night, that man got a visit from some fathers and said, if that ever happens again, we are going to do the same thing to you with chain. So that kind of, Frankie graduated, joined the Army. His name's on the Vietnam Wall. He was killed in combat. Now, I borrowed that in one of my books, but I made something good out of it. The kid did not die in Vietnam, and he got taken away from his family and sent to the Florida Sheriff's Boys Ranch, which is over in Suwannee County, where kids like that go, and they have a loving home environment. But so again, in all of the books, there's, you know, I didn't think all that up. I borrowed from a lot of folks' lives that I've known. But now this is the thing, you know, when you stop and think about it, and the same is true in every one of your lives, go back over your life and people that you have known, and there have been joys, there have been tragedies, you know, and there are a lot of interesting stories. I tell this sometimes when I address a group of people like the students that I did the other day. Everybody's life has a story. And some of the stories are very, very interesting. I interviewed a man in St. Augustine. I struck up a conversation with him a few weeks ago. He was sitting outside one of the art galleries working on a beautiful piece of pottery. And started a conversation. One thing led to another. And this man, he's 86 years old, 84 years old, I'm sorry. He had 7 careers in his life. 7 different careers. He grew up, when I say the TPC down there, Jacksonville, y'all know what I'm talking about, the big golf course where they have the TPC tournament down there? Yeah. Multi-million-dollar homes all over that area. When he grew up in Palm Valley in the 1950s, totally undeveloped, it was farm. He and his father-in-law had a 3,000 pig farm, 3,000 pigs at one time down in that area, 500 cows at one time, totally undeveloped, hunted, fished, they hunted alligators and that kind of thing. And I did a blog about him. I wrote about him. My point is, people, that they're interested in people all around us. They have stories, and so I can't take credit. It's just a matter of me just remembering, and then putting a lot of it into books. One more thing, and then I'm done. The book, the third book in the series, starts off here as Mark comes to pastor the First Baptist Church. His wife sends him to the store to get something because they've just moved in and they are short some things they need. So he goes to the store, he comes back, it's dark, and as he turns there from Center Street onto Fifth, somebody on a bicycle is crossing the street, and he has to hit the brakes. He doesn't hit the guy, he hits his brakes, and the guy wobbles and he falls. And he jumps out to help him, and the man is inebriated. I had been here about 2 weeks. I'm out in the front yard on a Saturday afternoon. The old First Baptist Church, the white house right across the street was the parsonage. We lived there. I'm out in the front yard, and an African-American gentleman comes down Alachua Street, and that bicycle is all over the street. And he gets right in front of our house, and he crashes on the sidewalk. And I rush over to make sure he's okay. And he rolled over and he says, "Call the police, call the police." I made sure, I said, "You really want me to call the police?" Because it was obvious he was totally inebriated. He said, "Call the police." I went inside, I called the police department. I said, "I know this sounds strange. I'm the new Baptist preacher." I said, "There's a man out on the sidewalk. He crashed his bicycle. He told me to come call you." He described, the policeman described the man to a T. I said, "Yeah, that's him." He said, "We'll be around there in a minute to get him." But I'm sure this man's been dead for years now, because this goes back 30-something years ago, and he was probably in his late 60s, early 70s then. Anyway, I go back out to kind of make sure he's okay. The policeman comes around. Policeman gets his bicycle, puts it in the trunk of the squad car, gets the fellow up, gets him in the back seat. He said, "I'll take him home." And then he turned to me and he said, "Preacher, if you ever need a good illustration for alcoholism," he said, "this is it." That man at one time, early in his life, he said had been a professor at one of the Ivy League schools and ruined his career. And how he ended up here, I don't know. And as I said, he's had to have been dead for years. But I borrowed that and start the book with this man and develop him into a character. And he's one of the prodigal sons, because my character is, they retire, they move to Fernandina Beach, and then his wife dies of cancer, and he blames God, and he starts drinking. And he's already told his Catholic, he's a member of St. Michael's Church here, and he's already told his priest where to go jump off. And so between the Baptist preacher and the Catholic priest, they kind of work together to get this guy straight again. But little things like that, y'all talking about inspiration. I sat out on the patio, drank my coffee, and watched the birds, and I remember this happening. And then it'll begin to develop and end up in a story there. And anyway.
Well,
that's it.
That is about it for today. So if you don't have any questions, I would invite you to come on over, let Jimmy autograph a copy of his book for you. You can take it downstairs. It is for sale. You can pay for it there. And I thank you all for joining us today. And thank you, Jimmy.
And I thank y'all. I appreciate it. And I am so glad you came, and I got